16-year-old Frank Abagnale Jr. lives in New Rochelle, New York with his father Frank Abagnale Sr. Christopher Walken and his French mother Paula Natalie Bay. Frank idolizes his father and is very proud to see him listed on the Rotary Club of New Rochelle's Wall of Honor as a lifetime member. But due to a series of IRS tax evasions, Frank Sr., their family is forced to move from their large house to a small apartment, causing tension between Frank's parents. Later, Frank enrolls in a public school where he shows up on his first day in his old school uniform. When he hears some boys in his class making fun of his uniform as he enters the classroom, saying that it makes him look like a substitute teacher, Frank walks in front of the class and pretends to be the new class's substitute teacher, even firing the real teacher claiming that there was a mistake. Frank's father is quite impressed with how far his son has been able to go with the scam. Returning from school one day, Frank catches his mother having an affair with his father's friend, Jack Barnes, James Brolin. His mother tries to buy his silence, but Frank is too upset to care. Later on, Frank returns home to find out that his parents are getting divorced. When he is asked which of his parents he wants to stay with, Frank runs away from home and uses his checkbook to fight his way to transportation and shelter. Seeing how they get VIP treatment wherever they go inspires Frank. He fights his way into a Pan Am Airlines pilot's uniform and learns more about the airline by posing as a tough college student reporting on Pan Am Airlines and interviewing one of its best and oldest pilots. Frank then uses the uniform and knowledge to create counterfeit Pan Am checks, which he successfully cashes at New York banks and hotels. The scam also works with the bank manager who turned it down before also being caught in the trick. Frank tries to run the same check scam at an airport, but is mistaken for a dead pilot who is expected to fly to Miami. Frank goes ahead and experiences his first flight followed by his first sexual experience with a flight attendant. In Miami, he purchases a check encoding machine at auction, which he uses to promote his schemes and create large quantities of checks. Meanwhile, FBI agent Carl Hanratty learns of Frank's check fraud and tracks the last forged check to a hotel. In another interview with Pan Am Air, Frank revealed that he has accumulated several nicknames such as Skyman and the James Bond of Sky. Inspired by this title, Frank buys a tie-dye outfit and gets an Aston Martin vehicle that he drives. He soon meets a magazine model named Cheryl Ann Jennifer Garner at the hotel where he is staying. She offers to spend the night with him for $1,000, but Frank claims he only got $1,400. Cheryl then demands that he take it back and give her the remaining $400 in cash. Frank was trying to use the stolen money to find a way to call back his soon-to-be divorced parents. He invites his father to a fancy restaurant and gives him the keys to a new Cadillac. Frank Sr. He explains that he can't accept the gift because the IRS is still watching him and Paula refuses to talk to him. When he sees Frank's birthday photo, Carl immediately recognizes him and finally knows who his suspect is. He then reveals that Frankie's mother verified that Frank had already stolen about $1.3 million from the fraud. Sometime later, while visiting a friend at a hospital in Atlanta, Francis meets and becomes interested in a young hospital nurse named Brenda Strong, Amy Adams. In the end, he wins over Brenda and her two loves. Frank and Brenda meet their parents in Louisiana, where Frank claims they are not just like Lutherans, but also lawyers and doctors. Brenda's father, Roger Martin Sheen, questions Frank about her feelings, leading to Frank openly admitting that he is not a lawyer, doctor, or pilot, but Roger takes this as a romantic plea and agrees to give up her daughter. Frank also passes the exam and joins Roger's law firm as an assistant prosecutor. IRS reveals to his son that his mother married Jack Barnes and moved on, which devastates Frank. He also reveals that he has been visited by the FBI and knows what Frank is doing. Frank desperately begs his father to tell him to stop, but Frank Sr. encourages him to continue instead. Upset that his father is unable to act like a father, Frank takes a leave of absence from Frank Sr. on Christmas Eve. Frank calls Carl at the FBI office, who is waiting for the call and asks his team to listen to him. Frank says he's done and sits down, telling Carl to stop chasing him. Carl informs him that this is not possible, as Frank has stolen about $4 million at this point. Frank understands and hangs up, not realizing he made a mistake telling Carl about the engagement to Louisiana, because he's dating a girl who thinks it's his real name. Changing her name would lead to too many questions. After going through the wedding announcements, Carl and his men manage to find Frank the night of the engagement party, which leads to Frank confessing to Brenda who he really is, before escaping through the window and telling her to meet him at the local airport. Several days later, but when she arrives as expected, Frank is devastated to see Brenda being watched closely by several undercover FBI agents that Frank easily creates. When Frank doesn't show up, Carl has his men watch the airport, certain that Frank will try to show him off somehow, and try to escape by plane instead of leaving town in a quieter way. Frank enacts a new plan, posing as a recruiting pilot for Pan Am, and visits a local college to recruit flight attendants for a flight to Europe. He holds auditions where he picks the hottest girls he can find and dresses them in uniform. He then heads to the airport, boss that Frank has forged checks throughout the Eastern Hemisphere, only this time the checks are real. Claiming that Frank is completely out of control, she asks for permission to follow him to Europe. His boss, however, denies him permission, stating that if Carl fails to capture Frank in the United States, he will not capture him in Europe. Carl refuses to give up and entrusts one of Frank's forged checks to professional printers who, from the quality of the check, deduce that it must have been printed on a certain type of printer available only in a few European countries, France being one of them. Recalling from an interview with Frank's mother that she was born in France, Carl travels to his hometown of Montréchard and finds Frank on Christmas Eve at a huge printer printing out thousands and thousands of checks. Carl informs Frank that he has come with the French police and promised them to arrest him himself, Carl for his ability to trick him. However, French police arrive almost immediately and escort Frank to prison, with Carl promising to extradite Frank to the United States. 2 years later, Frank is released into Carl's custody, as seen at the start of the film, and on Christmas Eve 1969, the plane extraditing Frank flies to the United States. As they prepare to land, Carl informs Frank, who has repeatedly asked to call his father, that Frank Sr. died accidentally. His escape leads them to the Barnes residence, where Frank meets his mother, happily married to his second husband, who now has a young daughter that is Frank's half-sister. Realizing that his father is dead and his mother is gone, Frank quietly surrenders when Carl and the local police arrive and arrest him before his mother and his new family find out who he is. Frank was eventually tried, convicted, and sentenced to 12 years in solitary confinement in a maximum security federal prison in Atlanta. For the next 4 years, Frank receives regular visits from Carl, especially at Christmas. During one of these visits, Frank easily identifies the scammer Carl is looking for by looking at a check. Him the check and he correctly admits it's fake as soon as he touches it, making Carl smile. In 1974, Carl arranged for Frank to be a FBI's check fraud unit. Although Frank is out of prison, he is chained to his desk job and misses the excitement of his old life. When he comes across a flight suit, Frank is tempted to pose as an airline pilot again. When he was about to fly, Carl met him at the airport. Carl lets him go free and predicts that Frank will be back at work on Monday because there will be nothing left to pursue. Show up for work on time. However, Frank shows up and the two begin to go through a recently discovered check forgery, which exposes them to new forgery techniques they have never encountered before. Checking the check, Carl asks Frank something that has been bothering him for years: how he cheated on the Louisiana bar exam. Frank says he didn't cheat and he studied for 2 weeks and passed his test. Carl asks if that's true, but Frank prefers to move on, focusing on the job at hand. It is then revealed via scrolling text that Frank has been married for 26 years, has 3 sons, lives in the Midwest with his family, is still good friends with Carl. The world's catch the toughest counterfeiters and earn millions of dollars every year for those unforgivable checks.